Welcome to Catholic in America. Today we're talking about superhero movies.
So we're going to talk about why superhero movies are so popular, why we as a society and the people need a mythology. What are some of the interesting corollaries between the superhero movies, Marvel and DC, and our Catholic faith? And what are some of the dangerous trends that are present in a lot of these movies?
So if you want to find out who beats who, Superman or Hulk, stay tuned.
All right, so welcome back to Catholic in America. Again, make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for all those who support us on Patreon. And we're talking today about a real serious topic. We've been hitting too many light topics recently. So today we're talking about Marvel versus DC. Captain America versus Captain Planet. No, I'm not quite sure. But really, and why this is so popular, we've seen these past several years, this past decade plus, where it seems like every other movie is basically a superhero movie, all the money that's been generated by these. And obviously it's touched on something. So why are these movies so popular?
Well, I mean, I think for lots of, at least for me, it's what I grew up with. You know, I grew up seeing these superhuman people and wishing I had, superpowers myself. And then, to see some of that acted out
for my childhood. If you had a superpower, what would it be?
I've been asked that before, and it used to be that I would be a shift changer, to change my appearance and all that kind of stuff. And then I got to thinking about the morality of that. See, there comes the Catholic, the Catholic part of that, and
Catholic
so
guilt weighing
definitely
in.
Don't want to read minds. I really don't know what other people are thinking. Really don't want to know that. So, I don't know. Telekinesis. I'd like to move things.
Oh, it's always flight.
Yeah.
That's not even.
But you can fly with telekinesis.
I guess that seems like an add-on to telekinesis, but Father Tom?
Oh, I have to think about that one for a minute. I'll get back to you later.
All right, but back to the why. Yeah. You have these things. It's in a sense, there's something from our childhood that's really amazing. I think it's kind of unfair that kids growing up nowadays have all these awesome superhero movies. We had Nothing. We had the Batman movie came out when I was a kid.
Yeah,
that was just kind of like a scary.
Where Michael Keaton couldn't turn his head.
That's right. And then there was like the Ninja Turtles, which is kind of a dark. And then everything else was made for adults. There was nothing made for kids. Now it seems like every movie's made for kids.
So you guys got that. I got the original Batman series with Burt Ward and Adam West. Yeah, that was the original, and that was it. I can remember as a 4-year-old going over to the neighbor's house. We had I would say, my grandmother during the day, I'd go over to my neighbor's house, and she had the record for that, and so it would play the record. You guys may not even remember that, but the record, it would play the Batman, theme.
Well, you remember Linda Carter as Wonder Woman.
I do. I remember Linda Carter as Wonder Woman. I remember the first Spider-Man TV series that was just straight up. No, we're not to that part yet, are we? Yeah.
but the why behind it, I think there's something about this recognition of you've got your good is fighting evil, and obviously they always try to nuance that within movies and as you develop characters and stuff. But there's like some sort of there's the good guys and the bad guys. There's something kind of fantastical about that, but in a sense sort of grounded as well.
And as a kid, it was clear. As a kid, when you're looking at these comics, it was clear because, let's face it, most of us didn't actually, like when I was 7 and 8, 9 and 10, I wasn't reading the things. I was looking at the pictures as I was going through it and the colorful things and seeing, Spider-Man or Superman or Aquaman or whatever they were doing, just seeing what they were doing. And at the end, they beat the bad guy or they're in some sort of peril. But there was this clear good and bad when I was younger.
So why are they so popular? What's the trend here? What's the underlying reason?
Stories are a way in which we convey meaning and where we convey purpose and ideals. And so, especially in the search for meaning and especially direction, because a story, tell me a story. Like stories give us direction, they give us purpose, they give us meaning, they tell us something which is interesting about someone else, and then the more that it's relevant to your own story, the more you can see yourself or read yourself into that particular character or story, the more that it's relatable. So I think that especially within this modern superhero trend is this element of where in the ancient world this would have been equivocal to mythology.
Yeah.
So in mythology, but the whole purpose of mythology in the ancient world, most mythological systems, they didn't actually believe these were real people or real persons, historical persons. especially like when you get into like a lot of the world religions and world mythologies, they didn't necessarily actually believe that Zeus, the vast majority of people didn't believe that Zeus was an actual historical character. Or that they didn't believe. There were some people who believed that they were, but a lot of people believe that, oh no, these are ways in which we convey meaning, which we convey stories.
Values of the
society.
Yeah.
And so like we convey our values through these different heroes or anti-heroes overcoming these different situations, and therefore we can take meaning out of our own life and we can project ourselves into these various different characters. So I mean, mythology, and that's kind of how I look at the modern superhero trend, which I think from our Catholic perspective, we can also look at kind of the breakdown of the family, children looking for meaning, people looking for purpose, looking for direction,
identity is a
looking
big,
for
identity.
Big aspect of this. Identity,
yes.
and where do I find my identity from, and especially for people who don't have good fathers or mothers, or even sometimes, I mean, I had good parents, and I mean, I loved. But I still, I was able to find meaning in these stories, and
that was a big thing in this last one, Moon Knight, that came out. The final one of the final fight scenes was
no spoilers. Okay.
Okay, well, yeah, this won't be. So the lady who's the other hero in the movie, she turns out to be a superhero, and there's a little girl in one of the fight scenes where she says, "Are you an Egyptian superhero?" And she says, "Yes, I am." And so there was a certain identity that really, it's being portrayed as this was the first Egyptian superhero and kind of the American mythologies you're talking about. And of course, the producer of the show was Egyptian and felt that was a very important thing. And now they're about to be releasing another show called Miss Marvel, and she'll be the first Muslim superhero. So you're right. The identity, I want to be able to see myself on the screen. I want to be able to see someone who represents me, my point of view, my philosophy of life, my culture on the screen. And I think right now DC and Marvel are starting to try and take that seriously, and that's what's kind of driving some of what they're doing, to outreach as well. I mean, you also had, what was Shang-Chi, I think it was
10 Rings.
Yeah, the 10 Rings. He was a Chinese character as well. And so seeing ourselves in those things, I think has always been important.
See ourselves, but be powerful and overcoming obstacles.
That's right.
And yeah.
Well, but at one point it was the virtues that you wanted to see. At least from my perspective, it was being a kid and seeing good overcome evil. And now it's more so. It's more seeing me be good and overcome evil. And so that's the reason why the identity is starting to come into those, the good versus evil, in it being important to have an Egyptian superhero or a Muslim superhero, someone that I can relate to.
Yeah, well, I think we'll get more into that too. But I do think about, like, kind of classically, that a lot of the superhero, the comic books and other things, in a sense, they're kind of morality plays. Sometimes they're sort of allegories for things going on in society. X-Men, really focus on that a lot, as far as, whether it was racial protests or injustice or characters that were kind of loosely based on civil rights figures, or also too, but like how people should respond, and when you don't respond the right way, the impacts that it has. So in a sense, it's like a way of teaching a moral lesson. So that's why I think we'll get into this later on. It's important what lessons are being taught. And kind of what's the direction that's leading this, because if it is shaping our moral imagination, if our mythology is shaping our moral imagination, then it's shaping it in a certain direction. And if it's a direction, if it's unintentional or is intended in a way that's different from the values of the direction that of the gospel, that's where we need to be able to look at it with a critical eye. Sure. So there is something just interesting about this, and I guess part of it is the fact we live in a capitalist country, and Hollywood is going to make movies based on what's making money at that time. We might be on to westerns in 10 years or something, where like every other movie is a western movie, or space movies or something. I'm not really sure, but I'm sure whatever it is, they'll follow that trend. They're not doing this for the art, and I think that there are artistic people that are involved. There's a lot of artistic and talented people involved there, but the reason these movies are getting made now is because they're popular, and it's seizing on people's imagination, and there's something I think too. Whenever I saw a kid at Mass this morning, he came out and and he's straight up I don't know, they're Spider-Man pajamas or Spider-Man kind of outfit sort of thing, and I just go, "What's up, Spider-Man?" And it's just sort of, he resounds with that, and he can see himself in that character, and there's something exciting about that, and just wanting to be strong and tough and stand up against even.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a little YouTuber, maybe a TikTok, I can't remember, of
you're so hip.
A child, of a child who's dressed as Spider-Man, and I think they're at Hollywood Studios. Is that where it would be in South? I can't remember. Whichever one they have the Marvel superheroes at, and there was a Spider-Man that was there, as one of the characters, and so the Spider-Man got down in that stance where he's got his arm up and he's down kind of almost in a 3-point stance, and the little kid does the same thing as well and mimics what Spider-Man's doing. And I think this is kind of what happens when you're younger, but I think what we're seeing is it even happens when you're older, and maybe not wearing the costume, although there are some.
A lot of people like to wear those costumes.
That's right. But the mimicking of what you see. And trying to see the good in those things. And I think that's the reason why it's so important what the stories are, and we're going to talk about it, but what the stories are, I mean, they really do matter. This isn't just entertainment and kids stuff. And for the most part, movies really haven't been. I mean, you do have a genre of movies that was kind of for entertainment, but lots of times, and especially it's starting to become more apparent with DC and Marvel, that there's also an agenda that's being pushed as well.
So we're going to talk a little bit more about that agenda. Mm-hmm. When we get back, I really wanted to dive into it's kind of like what is the direction that this is taking us as a society? The fact that so many billions of dollars, I guess, have been spent on this, have been so many millions of hours have been watched by so many millions of people. Like, what does this mean for us? How is this shaping us as a society? What is the direction? What are some of the good things that we've seen in some of these Marvel and DC movies? And what are some of the more troubling aspects of it as well? So we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Hey guys, thanks for checking out Catholic in America. I'm Father Michael Nixon, and I like to party.
And I am Father Tom Dillon, priest here in the Diocese of Pensacola, Tallahassee. I think I have the longest hair in probably the state, and I too like to party. I like whiskey and cigars.
Father Doug Martin. I'm also a priest here in the Diocese of Pensacola, Tallahassee, and I'm married and roll tide.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, yes, sir.
I was okay with the being married part, but the whole tie thing. In Catholic in America, we engage the intersection between faith and culture.
Tune in every week because no topic is out of bounds.
We want to thank you so much for supporting this show by watching it, by liking, sharing, and subscribing. How else can they support the show?
You can also become a patron on Patreon and support us financially.
So if you support us, there's all kinds of swag. There's t-shirts, there's coffee mugs, or maybe bumper stickers. I don't know. Maybe we could come up with a wig from Father Tom.
Father Tom wig would go a long way. So thanks for your support. God bless y'all, and check us out next time on Catholic in America.
Welcome back to Catholic in America, where we are talking about superhero movies.
So if you would, like, share, and subscribe.
So watching all these superhero movies, what do you think are some of the trends that you've seen, or even moments from whether it's Marvel or DC? We have Marvel versus DC here, by the way. This is the real showdown. That you say, okay, that's a great moment that can, whether like you might share it in a homily, you might see it kind of corresponds with our faith, or just an important value for our society to be lifting up.
Yeah, one that really comes to mind to me that's been one that's kind of spread over the several decades is the idea of with great power comes great responsibility. That theme you see from Spider-Man, that when you have great power, that you're responsible in how you use that power, not to lord it over people, not to take advantage of people, but to actually serve. And so and it's kind of a different turn on it because, I mean, I think that there's times that when we get the upper hand or we have the power, whether it's monetarily speaking or we're the boss or whatever it may be in society in general, that when we get that upper hand, it's I'm supposed to be served now. I'm the one who's in charge. I'm the one who's in control. And then also, my actions really don't matter as much because the repercussions are not as high. And so instead, what you see with these movies, with this whole dynamic is that the opportunity is to actually serve, to actually give, to use your power in a good way, not to lord it over people. And you see when they don't in the comic books, things start going sideways, or even in the movies, things start going sideways quick.
Well, I think, and also you have the major theme in almost every comic book series, whether it be Marvel or DC, but you have that theme of confronting evil, and confronting it, and the different manners in which you confront it. Like take Batman, for example, and like all the different Batman movies. I mean, one of the big major criticisms that I've heard of Batman is they're like, oh, well, Batman's kind of a boring character, Bruce Wayne's boring, but everyone really likes the villains. Well, in the Batman universe, like all the villains are various different, generally speaking, are various different severe psychological disorders. Yeah. So like every one of them is kind of a various different one. And so it's Batman confronting all these different type of crazies, whether it be the Joker or whether it be Bane or whether it be the Riddler or all these different, Scarecrow who uses fear. So it's Batman confronting all of these different ways in which evil or disorder is present in the world, and so he has to overcome them. And that's why it's not just like it's not a one-dimensional fight. It's like, and that's why sometimes, like in those stories, like you have evil in this fashion, with this fashion, they work together to try to overcome the good. But I mean that major theme, especially in the DC universe, is that what good always will triumph, and good triumphs over evil, and eventually somehow Batman outsmarts his enemies, or somehow always you'll find this notion of the triumph of good over evil.
Yeah, one of the things, this came up a lot with the Not Catholic in America, which whenever I say the title of our show is Catholic in America, people are like, Captain America? So I feel like Catholic in America. 3 separate words, but Captain America. Not to be confused with the amazing television show Catholic in America. Captain America, that his sort of journey in a sense is that he's a virtuous person and who's weak, who's bullied, who's all these things, and in a sense, but he's still willing to fight for something greater than himself. I think there's something kind of awesome about that, as far as like a healthy sense of patriotism, not just like a blind patriotism, but a love of for his country, but also a desire, to not let bullies, whether it's Hitler or Red Skull, again, it's that weird kind of mixing of reality with fiction, but that precedes his superpowers. In a sense, that's more important than his superpowers too. And I think there's something about that, because it's like, I may not be able to be as strong as Captain America, but I can try to do the right thing and stand up for other people, and throw myself on a grenade, which is one of the scenes. I think it's a powerful scene. It really is within that movie that speaks to us. And then in a sense, you put the superpowers on top of that, and it's like, okay, there's something. Yeah. Now there's a whole nother level of this really good heart that can now be beating up bad guys and punching out Hitler or Red Skull or whatever.
As a matter of fact, too, his worthiness to receive that serum was that he had the right attitude, the right virtue before he received it. I mean, that's what the doctor was looking for, because he had a bunch of candidates that they were going through to see who would take it. And of course, he was the one that you would think wouldn't take it. And the doctor was like, when he was willing to throw his body on the grenade, he was like, this is the guy, because he was willing to, because of the virtue he had, that they knew, well, he believed he wouldn't abuse the power he was being given.
Well, I think you also go to, let's say, who's probably sometimes called the most boring character in all
Superman.
of Superman.
Boring.
Who actually, you guys know, Superman is my favorite.
Yeah.
But people are like, well, he's so one-dimensional, like he has no weaknesses. But especially Superman was actually created by Jewish authors, like, because it was supposed to be kind of this Messiah type figure of showing that. And that's what people don't sometimes understand about, like, the Superman character, is that Superman is the embodiment of a person with power who chooses not to use it.
Yeah.
And so it's that whole notion of like having strength, having power, and having omnipotent power, or having almost near perfect power, and that he so often chooses either to use it for the good, for service of others, but there's also moments where Superman, everyone's trying to force him to use his power, and yet he constantly is telling himself no. So it's not the ability to use power which makes Superman great, and which makes him, but it's actually the ability of Superman to oftentimes to hold to restraint. And that's why, like that very Jewish notion of God as well, which is kind of found in that. Which is actually, if you look at like a lot of the Superman movies, he oftentimes will, especially from a Christian perspective, you'll find like, I remember the one with Brandon Ruth, like as he's falling through the sky, he's falling in a cruciform.
Yeah. Right.
And there's the clear allusions to Christ and clear allusions to that from the Christian elements, which picked up on the Jewish notions that were present in the original character. But in that character of Superman, going back to like the Jewish notion, is like what makes God great and which will make the Messiah great is this notion of not a person who says yes, but the person who says no. And that actually it's the restraint of power, and it's also why when in the Old Testament, when God says no, but he restrains his hand, when God has all the power to discipline, to beat them down, and yet God shows compassion and mercy by restraint, this is actually where God manifests his true power, which is, again, compassion.
Yeah, and you see also another one of those themes is sacrifice. You see quite a bit in both universes sacrifice. I know the Marvel one a little bit better, but as far as the way Tony Stark sacrificed himself, the way that Thanos sacrificed others, but not himself.
Right.
And so you have this dual theme of where does sacrifice happen? And when it happens outside of ourselves, everyone really could see how selfish Thanos was being. Even though it seemed like he had a good reason for it, he still come across as selfish. And whereas Tony Stark saving everyone, even though it made no sense necessarily.
And he seemed selfish.
And he seemed
like
selfish.
He was the most, originally he was the most selfish of all the Avengers.
Yep,
I mean, he
snarky,
was
all that stuff. So and you see that in almost all the Marvel superheroes is this idea of self-sacrifice.
There's a great scene in the in that original Spider-Man trilogy where with Tobey Maguire, basically.
That's the one where he was dancing emo?
Yeah, that one where he's dancing. Dancing is a big thing of it. Just where he stops the train. In a sense, it really is. It's a straight up, Christ figure that's being used there. He's cruciform.
Right.
His body's basically being destroyed for the sake of saving these people that are on the train with him. There's something about that. Like, there's something inherently uninteresting about the superhero who does the right thing and it costs them nothing.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So in a sense, what's the lesson that we could learn from that is that doing the right thing oftentimes does cost something.
Yeah.
Now, whether we as a society always embrace that, or maybe we can talk about some of the trends that we've seen that are dangerous within that are maybe teaching an opposite lesson. But I think at its best that we definitely see that consistently. One of the other things that came up too, and I think about this with Batman, is it's interesting, but a lot of the superhero characters are dealing with trauma. They're dealing, in a sense, like, what do you do with trauma? Do you allow it to fester and destroy you, which is kind of always Batman's constant struggle of he experienced, murder of his parents and spoilers, sorry. He experienced that loss. In a sense, he channels it in towards fighting crime and towards, but it's always kind of this thing that he's not quite dealing with, that he's kind of, sort of sublimating and going towards something else. But to see what does it mean for someone, or Spider-Man losing, his Uncle Ben, or Superman losing his planet, or
Star-Lord losing his mom.
Star-Lord losing his mom.
Yeah.
Like how do they deal with that or not deal with it? In a sense, it's kind of like an interesting take on humanity that you just sort of have put these superpowers and crazy cosmic adventures on top of, because no matter how powerful they are, they still have to. That to me is a great invitation to say, all right, are you looking at those areas of trauma in your own life? Are you processing them through counseling, through prayer, through deeper healing? Because if not, it's usually going to have adverse effects, and it might not be blowing up planets and stuff, right. but it does impact your life in meaningful ways.
Yeah, and that it doesn't hold you back. I mean, that's the, it's a clear theme you see. I think you were hinting on is it doesn't hold these guys back when they have these actual superpowers, but they have a reason to use them in a way that they shouldn't, or to just keep them to themselves and hoard them. Instead, even in their hurt and in their pain and their suffering, they're still giving. They're still being self-giving. And on the bad side of it, and then what we recognize is that those aren't. They turn inward rather than outward.
There's also there's another interesting element within the superhero movies, especially with some of the Marvel movies, is that the very source of their power and their weakness in some of the characters is the very source of their strength. So like take a character like Daredevil, right? So Daredevil, who Matthew Murdock, who is the only, actually, I think he's one of the only Catholic superheroes in the movie, except for Nightcrawler. Yeah. But Matthew Murdock, who I find really funny because I remember in the TV show, which recently came out, like there's the scenes where he's going into confessing his sins before he does the deeds. And, and the priest tells him, Matthew, you can't do this. That's not the way it works. You can't confess beforehand and then go do it. And he's like, well, because he just has that classic Catholic training, but he's blind, and he got blinded in that accident when he was a child, when acid got, I believe it was acid or something like that, got
toxic waste.
Toxic waste, hit his face.
In comic books, you know that means that it's something.
Something really bad. It's glowing.
But anyways, as he becomes blinded, though, it's his very blindness which becomes the source of his superpower. So his greatest weakness becomes actually his greatest strength. And so actually that's a big theme, especially in a lot of the Marvel movies, is like, is your weakness actually a strength, or is your strength, what you perceive to be your strength, you're actually your greatest weakness? And so this interesting thing, which also St. Paul gets into in the New Testament, which is like, in my weaknesses I am strong. And therefore, it's also this ability to sublimate our weaknesses, of turning our weakness and allowing a weakness. That's also the same point when people in a lot of those universes, especially you go into the DC stuff, when people live but like are angry in these things, like you find like all the different, like whether it be the Joker, which also, or you find the Riddler, you find all these things and the different ones, when they become self-absorbed and they allow their traumas to define them, they end up destroying themselves and others. Versus there's other ones who experience in their traumas these deep things, but they don't allow the trauma so much to define them, but they overcome that. But at the same time, they use those weaknesses that they have to actually further help other people, or to further like conquer their own fears, which I think is a really interesting way in which the comic books do get something right. And how do we handle our weaknesses? How do we handle the things that we first appear to us to be a curse, but actually these curses in a weird way become a blessing?
Lots of times too, the weakness for these superheroes is their service, is that they care, is that, Thanos is wanting to take out half the population. Well, these are people that they care about. Same thing with Spider-Man, Superman.
His only weakness is Lois Lane.
That's it.
You look at Kryptonite, but his real Kryptonite is his love for humanity.
His love for humanity, his love for her. Same thing with Spider-Man. You got Aunt May, and then you've got MJ, and you just go through all these characters that their weakness isn't actually another superpower coming against them and overcoming them, but it's actually themselves and how much they love and care and are willing to sacrifice. And then the questioning of how far are you willing to go?
Right.
That they're pushed to the limits.
And I do appreciate this as well, that there usually is some sort of moral code, whether it's laid out or not, that in a sense, like, they don't go beyond. The classic one that's often disputed is, Batman doesn't kill people. And then you see the clips of him, blowing people up and stuff like that. And you're like, what about those people? But like, or that Superman doesn't kill. In a sense, there's this sort of line that we don't cross. Now, in a sense, what distinguishes the hero and these from the anti-heroes, anti-heroes perfectly fine, Punisher's perfectly fine with killing. That's kind of what defines him too. But that these heroes are who they are because there's lines that they don't cross. And I think that's an interesting, and it usually puts them in danger. Their morality, in a sense, going back to it costs something.
Unless you're Deadpool.
Unless you're Deadpool, unless you're the Punisher, Kraven the Hunter. He's not really a hero, but there's a sense of that, and I think that's an interesting thing that we oftentimes are missing as a society is we don't necessarily have a moral code anymore as a society. So it's kind of like whatever's convenient for me kind of becomes my moral code. Right. And so if we're holding those up as ideals, I think that's a good thing to look to. It's not the entirety of morality, but it is at least a good mythology to have sort of under the surface there.
But it's something you see in Doctor Strange. I mean, in all of the Marvel movies, Doctor Strange is calculating lots of times, all right, what's the worst? Okay, if that's the worst, then we're going to do the next. And so sometimes it may mean costing someone else's life. He's willing to sacrifice their life to continue the good. But he's taken into consideration, right, what would be worse, 9 million people or just 9? I mean, the whole situation itself. And so it does show a certain relativism that comes and makes us question, what would I do in that situation?
Yeah.
Hopefully it makes us question that, because in the situation itself, in one of the characters in one of the recent movies with him, the question was no one. It shouldn't be between 9 million and 9 people. It should be no one. You should always protect life. And I thought that was very interesting.
Fascinating. So with that, let's dive into some of the troubling trends, or some of the trends that we can maybe see, that what are the philosophies behind that, and the way that they're taking as a society, the way that they're shaping minds and hearts. Again, kids obviously are watching this. Adults are definitely watching this. The trend's not going away anytime soon. Marvel Phase 4 and DC, restarting everything again for the 100th time. And I'm sure there's other, comic book stuff that's out there that's waiting to get made. But what are some of the trends that you're seeing that it takes it in a direction is not life-giving, is not setting a good morality or just mythology, as we discussed earlier?
I think that probably the biggest problem that I see, and I love superhero movies. I think I've seen every single one of them, but the problem that I see in at least the recent trend is as people keep pushing boundaries. Because it's also what sells, and that's also probably also one of the difficulties. As we keep pushing boundaries, we want a new story, we want something which is new and interesting, and which hasn't been done before. And at least, that was kind of the thing, like in the 80s and the 70s, is that the technology wasn't there. And I think that's one of the reasons why superhero movies are now finally have kind of found their end, and I don't think they're going away. Because you were not able to really do a superhero movie well in the 70s and 80s, because the technology, the graphics were not capable of it. So, but people are pushing boundaries, and they want something which is new. And so as stories become more complex, which is fine, like stories, actually that's part of the good part, is actually in the comic books themselves. Stories become very nuanced, very complex as the various different characters are faced with ethical dilemmas or situational dilemmas, and people are pushing boundaries. And that's why, the big thing for, obviously, in one of the last Superman movies was, the Man of Steel, he has to push the boundary. Is he going to kill? Is he going to violate that one rule, which is that he won't kill when he kills, sorry, spoiler alert, but he kills Zod, right? Likewise, the same thing with Batman. That's his one thing. So as each of them are coming across boundaries, because that's actually a big thing in all the superhero movies, is the boundaries and the line between good and evil. But as things have become, as now we're about 10, 15 years into the superhero movies, there's now a growing trend, which I see, which is that there are no boundaries. That all boundaries are merely constructs of the individual person who perceives them. And so this boundary, that there no longer is a line between good and evil, or if that line exists, it's relative to the individual person.
Yeah.
And so there no longer is a clear line of, okay, well, here's the ideal of selflessness versus selfishness. This is killing people versus this is rationalizing. You can legitimize this. And so maybe not so much in the intent of, I don't know the intent of always of the persons who are making it, but from the perspective of young people who are watching this, as they're seeing very difficult ethical situations. There was a really fascinating social commentary, in the second Captain America movie, which had Robert Redford, who played big business and big tech, or big military. And so as you see Captain America having to confront his own military his background and all the things that he had thought he had understood, but now he's confronted with the corruption. Then he says, how is he going to confront this? So as we've been punching
things is how it
but then the question becomes, but it's also buying into young people who are watching this Are they believing that there is good and evil and that there is a line, or is that the line is merely up to the individual person? And therefore, are some of the modern movies, whether it's intentional or not, are they teaching young people relativism?
Yeah.
That good and evil is just a social construct.
Right. Yeah, and following up on that, the sympathy, they make the evil characters look sympathetic. I mean, there was at some point until Thanos decided to wipe out the whole universe and start all over again. There was at some point where Thanos was almost sympathetic. I don't want you to kill half the population, but if it means that everyone's going to die, well then, in some ways, you're like, that's not completely unreasonable.
Well, even more so, look at the recent Scarlet Witch series.
Yes.
Which, again, we're not going to spoil too much of that if you haven't seen it, but the Scarlet Witch, she enslaves a whole town of people because she wants to live in her la-la land, her fantasy world.
Yeah.
And so, but she's painted throughout the movie, which is kind of the intention, she's painted as just this troubled, heartbroken person. But actually, as we know, the greatest evils in the world are committed by people, well-intentioned people. That's why we say the old adage, the road to hell is paved in good intentions.
Yeah, and that's where you see the sympathetic view of them.
There's not a clear line, and it leaves, especially for young people.
If morality is not objective,
and
then as long as your heart was in the right place, or as long as in a sense you can justify anything.
And that's kind of the way they've been coming across, especially with the bad guys. Is that you're right. The lines are not clearly as drawn. I mean, they're kind of faded, if even there at all, and you're kind of left to say,
even more dangerously. It's not necessarily, I don't have a problem with painting characters and giving them a complex psychological story. I don't have a problem with that. My problem, though, is that when they're paralleled to a person who stands for order or stands for justice or stands against whatever they're saying, and then that person is straw-manned.
Right.
And that the person who stands for order or justice.
So it's not the bad guy that's
who
doing
becomes the villain.
It's the good guy who's considered good, even though they're doing immoral or bad things, because they're doing it for the right purpose, whatever that is. And that kind of gets I think one of the things I think as far as like a trend or a direction is in a sense, and this goes into storytelling as well, that where the hero's journey that we mentioned is a pretty kind of consistent sort of mythological skeleton for a good story, as far as these humble circumstances, you encounter wisdom, your life is changed, usually shaped by some sort of tragedy. You have to grow and be broken down and be transformed into something new, and then you face the darkness. This whole kind of journey that every good mythology does, and every religions usually delve into that too. In a sense, what's maybe some of the pushing the boundaries, it's kind of like an anti-hero's journey, and this where now our stories, and this is a lot of the modern the latest things coming out of Marvel and maybe from DC too, I'm not exactly sure, where it's not about like I need to change, it's that like everyone else needs to change.
I need to be understood.
I need to be understood rather than I need to change. And I think and it's sometimes it's kind of coupling stories with whether it's a desire to uphold women as women characters, or minorities, or people who aren't in positions of power, that just everyone who's not the man is perfect and it never has to change or grow, but it just has to be understood, or like people have to take the lid off. So to me, that's kind of subjecting the interesting aspect of stories to this message that we're trying to put forward, and the message of inclusion, and the message of pro LGBTQ plus
my truth,
rights,
even swirled in there as well.
And to me, whether I would say we can also say like whether promoting LGBTQ under the guise of children's stories, whether that's morally correct or not. But it also just makes for uninteresting stories, where in a sense we've downplay the need for a journey because there's no change, there's no growth.
The only change happens when everyone else understands and accepts them.
Right.
Versus no, there's actually problems that this person has that therefore they're able to overcome those problems.
Yes.
Going back to what I was saying like before, if in one of the recent movies, The Eternals, which I saw, and was really interesting the way in which they depicted some of the characters in that movie, where a lot of those same themes of these different brutalized civilizations and the figures, the mythical figures from those civilizations, whether it be Gilgamesh, which the way they painted Gilgamesh, really interesting, is very, very unlike the Epic of Gilgamesh,
right,
where Gilgamesh is a brutal barbarian warlord who has no problem subjecting women and as well as like impressing and enslaving people, and that's kind of like the story, Epic of Gilgamesh. But he's painted in this very sympathetic light. Then you have like I remember it was really fascinating because there was this one scene where the Aztecs are being destroyed by like thousands of the Spanish were coming through and like burning conquistadors, even though there was only about 300, I believe it was, conquistadors in the whole thing. But it was just like these very interesting ways in which the past is being reinterpreted. Right, but it's not being reinterpreted according to the ancient stories. It's being given a new light, which I'm fine with that. But then you start having different things like the figure of, I'm trying to remember his name. He was the blonde character, Icarus.
Yeah, Icarus. Yeah.
Icarus, who was the law and order kind of policeman type figure. But then if you watch the very end credits, you very clearly saw who it was, because it showed the different statues from civilization showing them. And then all of a sudden Icarus, who ends up being the villain at the end of the movie, who's this totalitarian order, and I'm going to suppress and destroy these persons. And then you see the statue of St. Michael the Archangel.
Oh, my goodness.
Next to Icarus at the very end of this, of Michael who subjects. And so it's just these very subversive and subliminal messages which are being gone. Is that if you don't support, and which in the Catholic Church, I mean, we have a word for this, which is syncretism.
Yeah.
Like, it's that all religions are equally valid, all religions are equally the same, all philosophies are equally valid.
All truths are equal
all
truths,
things can work together, and that they can go in sync with each other, even though there's diametric differences between a lot of world religions, world philosophies, and they don't sync well together. And that's why when you paint them as being able to sync well, and then anyone who stands against syncretism,
which would be Christianity.
And therefore it's painted, and these become the unmerciful, unjust, brutal tyrants who subject minorities.
Watching a movie and being like, oh, they're making me the villain here is an interesting experience. So not just me, but basically the church, Christianity, followers of Jesus, to make that
Christians,
the villain.
We have reasons to be villainized for the various different things that have been done. But this is not the actions of individuals or things like that. This is the philosophies which are being villainized.
Right. Oof. Which is very different.
And if it's being taught implicitly, that to me is like, again, whether this is how intentional this is, they're all getting together and be like, let's undermine Christianity or Christian principles or values. Let's teach syncretism or just kind of universalism or a sense of morality that's just shifting according to our what our needs are at that time. And lift up, because there are things that they're lifting up, and it really is LGBTQ inclusion and celebration with characters that are being celebrated and included and put forward with which recognizes the dignity of those people. I have no problem at all. Right. But kind of like saying, so anyone who stands against them, being married or other stuff too, is now a villain, is now an evil person. The same thing too with whether it's minorities or other people that have been oppressed. To, in a sense, sort of simplify the complexity of those things, but then kind of lump everyone who stands against, who doesn't believe in gay marriage is the same person as these races. So, as racism or as, wanting to destroy civilizations or universes. So it is an interesting push that's being made. I know some of the comic book stuff that's been coming out recently. A lot of the comics, I hate to use the word, but have that woke, sort of litmus test where they get poured, and also the movies as well. They have to stand up to that kind of screening that goes on that ensures anyone who stands against us needs to be painted in the worst possible light, including making political enemies, making them Red Skull, which came up recently, where Jordan Peterson.
Jordan Peterson was painted as Red Skull.
Red Skull was basically where Red Skull was Jordan Peterson. Which is a fascinating.
That is interesting.
But another element which is also troubling and problematic, especially from a Catholic perspective, is the influence of magic and the occult, and sometimes outright like outright Satanism. And so like, it's no longer like some of the things that I've seen, especially recently, as kind of this magic and like going back to like Scarlet Witch, like, well, they're talking about chaos magic, which is that the chaos precedes order, and that was even some of the conversations that in the TV series. And I was watching that with philosophy background, and I've studied world religions extensively. I'm just like, oh, I know where this is coming from. And then like the new Doctor Strange movie, where he's obviously the Doctor Strange, the master of the mystical and the occult arts. But like some of the references in the new Doctor Strange movie were right out of the occult. I mean, that was the whole thing. Like he was fighting evil with evil. That was kind of the whole point of actually one of the, I'm not going to spoil too much, it came out recently. But he's fighting evil with evil. She's gone too far into evil. She did evil things, but he's going to have to defeat evil, not by overcoming it with good and by sacrifice, but he's going to fight evil with evil. Right. Which is why then like he draws upon occultish powers, even to a certain point where you have a very classic Eastern mysticism occultish symbol which appears on his head. And so like you have these things which are clear references from a Catholic perspective to the occult, even to a point where like in one scene in the movie, he is encloaked in the damned. As he's then fighting, using the dam to fight things like that. And so that's a very different way. And that's, I mean, something which is outright condemned, like especially when you start looking at things like that. And I don't think that most kids who get it, they just see a story. But the problem is that children who do have wounds, or children who are looking for things, or they just think that this is a story, that can be a very dangerous influence that then they start getting interested in very real things that can lead to very serious consequences, which as Catholics, obviously, we believe in demons. We believe that there are certain things that you can get, like there's a reason why we're not called to do any types of sorcery and why it was banned in the Old Testament. Not because it didn't always work, because sometimes it does work, but you don't realize the deals with the devil.
What you're opening yourself up to.
And the degrees of the evil that you're willing to go
Correct.
to. Okay,
And
she's really bad. He's not quite as bad. So that's okay.
Yeah, and therefore he's able to harness evil and use evil to fight it, but
for good.
For good.
Yeah. As long as I have the right intention in mind, I can do evil things.
Correct.
And I think that's a pretty common just sort of trope in our society, and it's definitely put forward in a lot of the superhero movies. Obviously, it's a lot bigger and more flashy, but in a sense, for me to say, well, passing school is a good thing, so if I just cheat,
right?
You know, I'm doing it for the sake of passing because I want to get good grades, get into a good college, and support people with making lots of money. So in a sense, it kind of becomes what can we excuse rather than saying there's something true to which I am bound. It's greater than myself, and that's when we recognize that the moral life of Christianity is not a straitjacket holding, which is often kind of portrayed as, but it's actually an invitation to greater freedom because I live in the freedom of not having to constantly create my own morality, but in being a servant of truth rather than some sort of person who arbitrates it. So within this, okay, so we talked a lot about the superhero movies, why they're popular, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Maybe we can just kind of close out here in this conversation with you guys sharing your opinion of the one movie that you would recommend if someone's like, I don't know about superhero movies, and then let's get the vote. Is it DC or Marvel? So that three priests on this Catholic in America panel can decide once for all whether the DC or Marvel is where it's at. I'm going to go first, okay? And I'm going to say one movie to avoid is any of the DC movies because they're terrible.
Not true.
I was going to say, that's the question. Are we talking about movies or are we talking about DC, Marvel, period?
That's probably the biggest problem with DC is that generally speaking, their movies are not that great.
Yeah, so I would say some of the Batman movies are interesting. The Christopher Nolan Batman movies are great. Actually, a good one to watch though. I'm just going to put this out there: is that Spider-Man: No Way Home? I thought it was a really good movie. Again, maybe some of the messages are not exactly on with Catholicism, but as far as self-sacrifice, redeeming pain, just all those sorts of things,
being willing not to be seen. I mean, those sorts.
Absolutely. And I'm going to have to go with Marvel in the Marvel versus DC sort of battle. So we got one vote for Marvel. So I don't know who wants to go next.
So you're saying movies. The movie that I would probably put forward first, and it's going to be sappy by today's standards, but in the time, it was one of the greatest, and I still think it's the best Spider-Man movie. Maybe not as good as the last one, but it's to me, it's a close call. It's the second Spider-Man movie from the Tobey Maguire era, and just the idea that came across so clear in that movie, which was sacrifice, self-sacrifice. With great power comes great responsibility, and the willingness for him to put the good of the other in front of himself, the good of the people, the good of Mary Jane, the good of his aunt, and to be willing to give service when it doesn't seem like you're wanted or you're needed, and even in the criticism, to be willing to do the right thing. So to me, if you're going to start with any of them, that'd be the first one I'd say to start with. So which means obviously I would vote Marvel, but it's funny because growing up, I was a DC guy. I mean, I didn't like Marvel comics because I thought they were weird. The DC comics, even though they were kind of weird, still made a little bit more sense to me, I guess, in my childish stage. And so my favorite superhero was always Batman. Always. Yeah. Spider-Man was a close second, but Batman was always my go-to. So, I feel like I'm kind of turning on my own child self, but I at least with the movies, I'd have to say it's Marvel for sure.
I don't think there's any argument that the Marvel movies are better,
right?
Artistically, well done as well as the story. I'm still going to go though with DC overall. DC, I like DC because DC is big picture. It's stories, it's ideals, it's clashing of ideas, which I think actually Christopher Nolan did a fantastic job in the Batman series of the clashing of ideals and systems of thought, especially where you had these big ideas of kind of Ra's al Ghul versus Batman, but you had that kind of that relativism and utilitarianism as it confronts order. Then you had chaos, absolute chaos, which confronts. Which also steps in when you get rid of organized crime, ordered evil, then chaotic evil comes into its place. So I think that on the
Joker and stuff.
The Joker in the second one. Then you get rid of the Joker, and then you have again ordered, regimented evil, which comes in with Bane. So I think it's interesting the way that I think Christopher Nolan did, and I would highly suggest the Chris Nolan movies they're a little bit obviously mature, so I would suggest them for children because they, really good. But I'd say, by the way, my superpower, I'm going to take I am starting to get like some gray streaks in my hair, so I'm going to take the rogue superpower from X-Men.
All right, so
I'll suck other people's powers and end up with all of them.
Then you take it back from Captain Marvel, so then you get you get flight and strength.
You need her. I mean,
no one touches you. That's the thing. Like no one can mess with you because.
No, but the Marvel movies though definitely their stories are more relatable because it's more person centered and vice that. But I'd still say my favorite one is Guardians of the Galaxy #1.
Okay. So a lot of good aspects to this, but a lot of stuff to be watched, particularly some of these, some of the currents of philosophies that I think are behind these. But overall, we voted here. It's 2 votes for Marvel versus 1 for DC. So at least on this panel, that's what's been decided. Yeah. We'd love to hear your comments and your responses to that. This will probably be the one that we get the most anger out of. But Father Tom, Father Doug, great chat with you guys today. Thank you all so much for joining us today on Catholic in America, and we'll see you next time.